Welcome to the first of the Perth US Asia Center of Foreign Policy Conversations in the year 2021. For much of the last year, as we've done these types of events, both virtually and in person, we've focused on some of our core business as a foreign policy think tank: trade, investment, national security, defense. And yet, when you speak of foreign policy and when you think of international relations, there really is a much broader spectrum that we're able to deal with on a regular basis. We're all familiar with the concept of soft power. Early on in the existence of the Perth US Asia Center, we put out a series of annual reports looking at smart power, the combination of soft power and smart power. But if you think more broadly, where there's intercultural relationships, sports diplomacy, et cetera, there is a very important underlying foundation to international relations that we don't give nearly enough time. Today, I'm delighted to be joined for a conversation by Andrew Hunter. Andrew is relatively new, moving to Perth. He is a strategic advisor at the Minderoo Foundation. He works there together with former South Australian Premier Jerry Weatherall, working on early childhood education. I'll have a chance to ask you more about that in a minute, Andrew. But for the purposes of our conversation today, we're bringing Andrew on, given his tremendous experience in sports diplomacy. Andrew spent 5 years with the Port Adelaide Football Club, was responsible for and directly involved in their engagement with China. Andrew is the author of a book, Port Adelaide to Shanghai. I think the subtitle is Taking Australia's Game to the World. I think it's available both for booksellers here in Australia as well as on Amazon.com. But it presents us with a remarkable opportunity to look at Australia's relationship with China from a different lens than just trade and commodities, or candidly, the more contestational trade wars that we've had for the last 6 months. So Andrew, thank you so much for your time. We appreciate you joining us.
Gordon, good to be with you.
Now, before we kick off and before we jump into some of the experiences you had that led to you writing a book, let's introduce you better to the audience. I know that you had a growing community of friends here in WA, but I also recognize that 2020 was probably not the best year to get out and about and make new friends, even in Western Australia. You were a professional volleyballer. You represented Australia internationally. I understand your wife is a two-time Olympian. Again, as mentioned before, you spent 5 years at the Port Adelaide Football Club. But I also understand that you have a master's degree, a master's in philosophy and Asian studies from the University of Adelaide. I want to just give you a chance to tell us a little bit more about yourself, your interests and your passions, and more importantly, what got you into footy, and then what got you from there to Western Australia.
I had a misspent youth, I think it's fair to say. After studying initially at the University of Adelaide, I pursued my dreams playing volleyball, and I played in Europe for around a decade and a few games for Australia, but our national team was based in Canberra, where I had the opportunity to meet Sally for the first time a while ago now. And then returning to Australia, we lived together in Canberra initially, then in Adelaide, and then we've moved to Perth. So in between times, I moved back to Australia when I was 30. I wanted to be involved in politics. So as a 30-year-old who hadn't worked before but had studied a little bit, who had used a lot of his time pursuing this dream in sport, I had some decisions to make on that plane back, and I was really moved by the desire to be involved in politics, and that eventually led me to be the speechwriter to the Premier of South Australia, Jerry Weatherall. And all roads seemed to lead to Perth. So got offered the job. It was just too good an opportunity to let slip, given, I guess, Sally's desire with a young family to return to be close to her family.
Well, I think you have a very different definition of misspent youth than I do, but a remarkable career thus far in terms of your involvement in politics and sports as well. Before we get into the focus on the Port Adelaide Football Club and your experience in China, I'd like to talk about Asia a little bit more broadly. You did a master's degree in Asian studies. Tell us a little bit more about your experiences in and your interests in our region, in the Indo-Pacific, in Asia.
Yeah, sure. I guess since I'm not sure why, but since I was a young boy, I had a fascination for Japan. So I guess it started there. When I was a university student, I had the opportunity to study at the International University of Japan in the International Relations School there as an exchange student. I actually wrote my my honours thesis there. So it started off with an interest in Japan, which led to an interest in the Australia-Japan bilateral, and that was a really beautiful moment in my life, living there in Niigataken at the foot of the Japanese Alps in snow country, and really, I guess, developing a worldview, an understanding of the world, and I guess a sense of Australia's potential place in it. So that never left me. In between times, I did go and live in Europe and played volleyball, but I was always, fascinated by this idea of Australia developing a particular place in the world, which is a vision to which I continue to hold on tightly. I guess there are moments where I've tried to return to that. I was a speechwriter for the Premier of South Australia, which was an enormous honour. But in 2014, a funny thing happened. He won an election that wasn't expected of him. And basically, there was an anticipation that he would lose that, and a lot of the members of the staff, I guess, had other plans and were thinking about potentially after the election going elsewhere. So, buoyed by this unexpected victory, he was bouncing around the office, and he walked into my office and said, what do I need to do to keep you here? And I said, without really any reflection or thinking, I said, well, I'd love for you to make me a senior advisor for international engagement, which is a role that didn't really exist before. And he sort of shrugged his shoulders and he said, yeah, sure, whatever, no problem. So I started in that role in the Premier's office, which gave me an opportunity to, I guess, go back to some things that were a great passion of mine when I was a little bit younger, interrupted by sport. And then ultimately this job at Port Adelaide came up, where they had this idea of doing something in China. So it was a nice way of, I guess, combining my love of sport and love of international engagement.
Now, before we get to the China part of the story, you will recall from our previous conversations that I was actually born and raised on the Navajo Indian Reservation, the Navajo Nation, Native American reservation in the middle of America. So northeastern part of Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado, and Utah. And there's very few people here in Western Australia that I've come across with, or crossed paths with rather, that have either been there or even know about that region. And yet through your work with the Port Adelaide Football Club, you had a chance to visit the reservation. Tell us a little bit about that experience before we jump into the meat of the book.
Yeah, you could say, Gordon, that there was a little bit of fate involved in our first meeting. When I first had this opportunity to come to Perth and I wanted to know a little bit more about it, I spoke to a great friend, Kent Anderson, and I spoke to him. I'd just been to the United States for the first time, where I'd been to Washington, D.C., the Navajo Nation, and Tucson to meet up with Noam Chomsky. And Kent said, look, if you're going to Perth and you've just mentioned that you've been to the Navajo, you've got to meet this guy called Gordon Flake. And he told me a little bit about your background. So, there was a time about a year ago, we had this budget for professional development at Port Adelaide that was open to senior execs. And I hadn't used it until that point. And I thought, whilst making this decision as to whether or not I want to stay in Port Adelaide, I'll use this money, I'll go and spend a week with the Washington Wizards in Washington, D.C. to know a little bit more about the sports industry. But at Port Adelaide, we always had this real sense that you could use sport for other reasons and use sport for community development. And we'd invested a lot of money at the time in our Indigenous programs. And I wanted to see what other models were out there. And Chinle High School famously used the sport of basketball to get the best out of their students involved in the programs, and that has driven better academic results for that particular school. So I became aware of that program through a documentary, and I thought, well, if I'm going to be in Tucson, Navajo Nation isn't too far away. So I reached out to the school and spoke to them, and was able to spend a couple of days there. And the Navajo Nation, I mean, it is the most beautiful country I've ever seen. So apart from the learnings I took from the local culture there, and also from the program at the school, and I'm not an aesthete, but I was struck by how beautiful the place was. So, someone like yourself growing up in that sort of environment, I can't imagine how wonderful some of those things would have been to see and to live during your youth.
Well, again, I appreciate that retelling, because it does make me a little bit homesick, with one exception. The place where you visited, Chinle High School, was our arch rival. I went to Winderoo High School, about miles away. But I do appreciate it. And their particular passion for sport is the interesting thing, because the phrase that you just used, using sport for other reasons, is really at the crux of the book. So let's launch into a bit of a discussion about the book itself. Tell us a little bit, just a brief overview, because we want to entice people to actually read the book, of your experience at Port Adelaide, your role there, and how you took Australia's game to China. And then we'll come back with some specific points of discussion therein.
Sure. Well, initially when I went to Port Adelaide, I mean, the reasons for going to China were very commercially motivated. The club is one of 90 professional sporting clubs in Australia, which is about the same number of professional teams as there are in the United States, which clearly has a much bigger population and market. So it's a very contested landscape in terms of sponsorship dollars. And the club at the time, with David Koch as chair and Keith Thomas as CEO, was really trying to innovate and to find different commercial models that might sustain the club into the future in the context of this really highly contested landscape. So China, this is back in 2014, it had a very different allure in Australia as it does now. It was seen to be very positively, particularly by the business community, as South Australia had a very strong relationship with Shandong province particularly, but China more generally. So it was a natural place to go. So the club had this idea, but didn't really have an understanding of how to go about it. They didn't have any expertise on the ground by nature of being an Australian rules football club. So a very chance meeting with Keith Thomas, CEO, who I'd known previously. And at the time, I was the senior advisor for international engagement. So he probably thought that was a reasonable place to start. And after 7 years of working as a political advisor, I did want to broaden my experiences a little bit. So things came together and started working at Port Adelaide and pursuing this quite ridiculous dream of trying to derive a commercial benefit from activity, taking Australian football to China.
So I actually recall the chairman of the Perth US Asia Centre Board of Directors is another former South Australian Premier, John Olsen. And he kindly arranged several years ago for me to take a trip to Adelaide. And I recall being in the airport lounge flying on the way home, surrounded by a lot of gentlemen who were far taller and far more fit than I am. It was the Port Adelaide football team on the way to China, which was, on the news at the time, quite exciting. Tell us, kind of in the end, that you had how many matches were played in China? What was the trajectory there?
So we played 3 games there in 2017, 2018, 2019. Played 2 matches against Gold Coast and a final match against St Kilda. So, I mean, right at the beginning, I mean, the idea of playing a game in China was a pipe dream. The idea of getting sponsorship out of China was a bit of a dream as well. But in the first couple of years, things went very quickly. We achieved some wonderful things. The Australian government was involved, and I thought saw our unique platform, or the unique platform we were trying to develop in China, as something that was positive for the bilateral relationship. So those first 2 years were halcyon days. We had Malcolm Turnbull that was announced our desire to play a game in China on his first ever visit to China, as CCTV signed a broadcast deal to broadcast AFL games during the 2016 season. So these remarkable things all came together and culminated in that first game in China in 2017 that really was a wonderful moment.
So if I understand correctly, Port is undefeated in China, is that correct?
It is our most successful playing ground at the moment, having never lost there.
That works. Let me take that and draw some broader conclusions from that, if I might too. One of the challenges that Australian businesses are facing more broadly is that through much of our history, demand for economic interaction with Australia has been driven externally, whether it was demand for Australian agricultural products, back in the UK, or recently coal or iron ore or now LNG. There's been a pull. It's a far more challenging thing to take and sell Australian products and Australian services into the world, and in particular to our near region, the Indo-Pacific, where things are familiar. But there's a quote in your conclusion, your last chapter, which I thought was quite telling. You wrote, "This was not easy to develop, particularly in China, where they were unfamiliar with and unenthusiastic about your core product." So taking Australia's game to a place where they're unfamiliar with enthusiastic, what kind of core lessons did you learn from that process that might be a benefit from Australians, regardless of sector or service, who are looking to introduce products or services that might be unfamiliar. How did you go about that?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think in reality, I mean, Australian football was unknown in China and there was no real demand for it. So we had to derive a value from understanding where that value might lie. And for us, we saw football as a carrier of Australian culture and a great way to develop, for Chinese companies looking at Australia, a deeper connection with the Australian people. I mean, I don't think these things are only applicable to China, and China has been a really important part of my own trajectory and journey. And certainly, it was a fascinating way to spend 5 years pursuing this dream in China. But I think some of the lessons are equally applicable to some other countries in the region with which we're going to need to engage more fully, I think, in the future. And for us, as you said, there is a real demand for Australian products for a long time, and as a consequence of that, I think some of the relationships could be built in a transactional way. And I think the one thing that we learned from what we were doing in China is the importance of having an intercultural mind, of developing real relationships and also developing relationships openly with a country and with cultures that are where worldviews are built fundamentally and framed in different historic, economic, cultural, political, linguistic contexts. So I think from Australian perspective, it's not going to be as easy in the future to develop, transactional relationships based on real demand. And I think we're going to have to be a little bit smart about what we're doing and perhaps taking a different approach to the way potentially we build relationships with our region.
Now, look, I recognize that Japan and China are very different cultures, but your early experience in Japan, your international experience in international sport, I presume they also influenced the way you engaged at a professional level with China while you were at Port Adelaide. Any insights from that experience?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, the experience of living in Japan was a wonderful one. I guess I had a closer understanding of that culture because it's been a country and a culture that I'd followed and I'd found attractive for a long time. Whereas China, there was less an attraction rather than a fascination. But I think it goes back to a similar thing, and it would be similar, I think, if I had a greater engagement in India, another country with which I'm fascinated, is not to go there with any inbuilt assumptions. So I think you see Australians, particularly from our particular context, which is that a traditional Australian sporting club, always trying to refer back on what they're seeing in China and in another country based on their own experience of Australia. And I think that's the sort of the opposite of the intercultural mind that I think I found useful in the engagement in China. If that's always your reference point, then I think you're going to come into some trouble because the worldviews are too differently framed and formulated for that to be sort of an effective mechanism for engagement.
So, not to put too much on the shoulders of sports diplomacy or people-to-people engagement, the Australia-China relationship has taken a relatively sharp downturn in recent months, where Australia is on the receiving end of some rather punishing kind of trade sanctions from China, and obviously the wonderful initiative that you started at Port Adelaide has been impacted, like many other things, by our inability to travel, by COVID, et cetera. But I'm curious as if there's any longer-term residual lessons or benefits that you see that will take us beyond the current difficult patch that we're in, that we got to be paying attention to as we prioritize sports diplomacy.
Yeah, I mean, I think sports can be a part of a suite of different tools for engagement, and not just in China, but in any country. I think Australia would be well served to have an omnidirectional foreign policy. And sport, I think, should be considered a really natural tool for us to use because we love it. Because there are very few places in the world where there isn't a natural attraction to sport, and it's a common ground. I think our advantage with China, and particularly the way China considers sport, it's a very like many things, it's an expression of their national identity. So, but we happen to be playing a sport where they didn't care less if they, who won and who lost. So that made things a lot easier, right? Because there was nothing really on the line, but rather we could use it as a platform around which people can come together. For me, the learnings really from a sports diplomacy perspective is that playing one game of football in China every now and then wasn't really going to serve a purpose. And indeed, after the, I think, enormous success of the game in 2017, if we'd continued to play that game in isolation year after year, then then the initiative would have died. But in 2019, the game became part of the Festival of Australia. So Austrade and the Australian government and DFAT invested in a platform where they brought together trade, investment, sport, government to government in one platform. And I think that's the opportunity for sport not to be considered in isolation as a diplomatic tool, but to be one of many tools that you can use in an omnidirectional foreign policy.
Well, might I be so bold to suggest, after the results of this most recent cricket test match with India, that maybe the next step is for us to look at similar initiatives with India or Indonesia or Vietnam or Japan or other areas where those opportunities might once again present themselves post-COVID?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, Gordon, you'd know far better than most some of the great steps that have been taken in the Australia-India relationship. If you're going to take that as an example, some of the institutional connections that have been built and the mechanisms to work together, whether it be through government to government or through defence security policy. But I think to be able to broaden these relationships out, I think people to people is a really important part of international relations. And I think it also, for me, it provides a more enabling environment for good foreign policy. I mean, people say the cliche is that all politics are domestic. So, what we can do to develop a broader understanding of these different countries, in the case of Indonesia, in our backyard, and India, and certainly in our region, that will help our leaders be able to make good decisions in the national interest and not have that, I guess, that populist impulse where in some cases you feel like you are playing to a domestic political audience, where really if there's a greater understanding, a little bit more affinity between Australians and a lived experience with different peoples around the world, then I think that's an enabler for good foreign policy. So I tend to think the people-to-people stuff's really important, and I think we can do a little bit more with it.
Well, hey, look, that's a fantastic note to end on. I love your phrasing, creating an enabling environment for broader foreign policy. Clearly, that's something that you've been involved with. We are very fortunate now to have you here with us in Western Australia. So we're delighted. It's a year late, but welcome formally in that process. I would note that I cheaply made sure that I had my document on the shelf because I want to make sure that I'm even balanced in this process. But for all of you who are watching this, if you're interested in the effort that Andrew and his colleagues put together, the book is From Port Adelaide to Shanghai, Taking Australia's Game to the World. Again, it's available at most booksellers here as well as Amazon. Fascinating read. And Andrew, thank you for sharing your insights with us today. We look forward to engaging you in our WA International Affairs community going forward. Thanks again.
Fantastic. Thanks very much, Gordon.